Let's talk about Dick Tracy. Dick Tracy is a fictional police detective who appears in the newspaper comic strips. He first appeared in 1931, and the strip has never been canceled. It is indeed still running, although I don't think anybody actually reads it anymore. Let me know in the comments if I'm wrong about that. But at one time, he was a really big pop culture deal. He was at the height of his fame in the 1940s, in the 1950s, and then gradually dropped into obscurity after that. Like many of my generation, I first heard of him when Disney released a movie about Dick Tracy in 1990. Now, if this is before your time, if you weren't alive when the Dick Tracy movie came out in the 1990, it was interesting in that it was very heavily marketed. You saw Dick Tracy commercials everywhere. You saw Dick Tracy merchandise everywhere. Disney really went all out marketing this movie. And I've always found it rather fascinating how completely the movie disappeared from popular consciousness in the following years. Although I guess it's not completely surprising because it was a very forgettable movie. But we'll talk about the movie maybe another day. I don't want to get sidetracked talking about the movie. I'm here to talk about the comic strips. But I first found out about these comic strips when the movie came out. And when there was this huge marketing blitz and a lot of Dick Tracy books were in the bookstores and a lot of Dick Tracy strips were being reprinted. And I went from never having heard about Dick Tracy at all to being completely obsessed with him. And in retrospect, it seems fairly obvious that I just got completely taken in by Disney's marketing. Although that's not the way I looked at it at the time. At the time, I just thought, well, it's the kind of thing that I'm predisposed to like anyways, and the Disney marketing is just making me aware of it. And to be fair to myself, I guess it is kind of the thing I was predisposed to like anyways. I liked detective stories. As a young boy, I liked action comics. Any kind of violent comic was interesting to me. And, I've always really liked retro stuff. And especially when I was young, I was fascinated by pop culture from the decades before me. How people my age and decades previous had been into different stuff than people my age are in now. I don't know why, it just really fascinated me. So once I found out about Dick Tracy and found out that he had been really popular in the previous decades, I got really sucked into researching the history of Dick Tracy. Now, this was before the internet, before Wikipedia, so I was just limited to buying books. And there were a few books in the local bookstores. The stuff was being reprinted in connection with all the publicity from the movie. There was the Celebrated Cases of Dick Tracy. That was a softcover collection of Dick Tracy comics that were reprinted. There was the Dick Tracy Case Files. There was another book I had, which I forget the name of it, but it was like a history of Dick Tracy. So it had some strips, but then it had like a lot of text explaining the strip and explaining the different periods that the strip had gone through. And I was just completely fascinated by this stuff. So Dick Tracy, in the years he's been in print in the comics, has undergone a number of different phases. And he's got a supporting cast, which has also undergone a number of changes. So new characters will come in. Occasionally, every once in a while, an old character will get killed off, just to shake things up or keep the, gin up some controversy. There are different phases that the character went through, like in the 1960s, apparently a lot of the strips took place on the moon, and there was this whole space age that got integrated into the strips, and characters like Moon Maid and the Moon Maiden got introduced. I don't know why, but as a young boy, I was fascinated with the idea of lengthy stories, ongoing stories, and long continuity. A classic geek, I guess. Fascinated with this stuff in DC and Marvel comics, and fascinated with this stuff in long-running newspaper comic strips. Now, at the time, I think I would have given my eye teeth to be able to read all the Dick Tracy comics from the beginning all the way up to the end, or all the way up to the present day. But they weren't being reprinted at the time. But that was 1990. We are now living in, I don't know what exactly changed about the culture, but somewhere along the line, the culture changed. So we're now living in a line where we are now living in a time when it's much easier to be a collector, where it's much more popular for these companies to publish comprehensive collections of these old strips and old comic books. So the Dick Tracy, the complete Chester Gould's Dick Tracy, started being printed in 2006. This is volume 1 here. Now, 2006 was almost 20 years ago now, 19 years ago. But I am, as always, a bit late to the party on this. If you watch this channel, you know that I've been living abroad for many years. And so, excuse me, I've got a bit of a frog in my throat, obviously. I'm got a bit of a cold here, and well, it is what it is. I've got some hot tea here, and I'm going to try and struggle through this review. We'll see how it goes. But anyways, because I've been living abroad, I haven't had a chance to catch up with these. But now that I'm back in the U.S., I've decided to get these out from my local library through interlibrary loan. They don't actually have these volumes at my local library, but I ordered them through interlibrary loan. Now, even through interlibrary loan, which I believe gives me access to almost all the libraries in the state, I still can't. It looks like still not all the volumes in this collection are available. Possibly because they first started coming out in 2006, so maybe copies have gone missing and have not been replaced, etc. I was just going to the Amazon page for this volume, and they say it's sold out there. Or no, maybe it was this volume. Anyways, some of the volumes are sold out currently from Amazon, so it looks like if you're a library and you lose your copy or it gets damaged or something like that, there might not be an easy way to replace it. That might be why there are some gaps here. So, I am not going to be able, at least as long as I'm relying off of the public library, to do all the volumes, but I will do the volumes I can. I've got a feeling that doing some of the volumes is largely going to satisfy my curiosity. It's going to satisfy that urge to go back and read all the Dick Tracy comics. We'll see how I feel at the end of this read through. But this is one of my next projects, is to try and get these out of the library, the ones I can find at least, and review them. So this is volume 1, 1931 to 1933. And then volumes 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11. I can't find out of my local library. But the next one is volume 13, 1950 to 1951. So, in a way, this is kind of unfortunate because Dick Tracy's peak cultural relevance was in the 1940s, and it looks like as long as I'm relying on my local library, I'm going to be skipping over that completely. But a lot of those classic Dick Tracy comics from the 1940s, the Flat Top, the Brow, 88 Keys, Itchy, etc. I read those back in 1990 when they were republished in those collections. Well, it is what it is. These are the ones I can get a hold of. So this one we will do on another day. But here I am reviewing Volume 1, comics from 1931 to 1933. So the first thing to note about this reprint collection is it's a little bit oddly shaped. And for comparison, here is a graphic novel of the New Teen Titans. This is what a comic book normally looks like. And this is the Dick Tracy one. So it's doesn't fit on the bookshelf nicely. It's long and short. And I guess they do that because they've decided that the comics themselves, originally being 4-panel newspaper comics, best fit this format. But, I mean, it strikes me that it doesn't have to be this way. And again, when I was reading the reprints that came out in 1990, the celebrated cases of Dick Tracy or the Dick Tracy case files or something like that, those were reprinted more or less like a conventional graphic novel, the standard rectangle type shape, looking like a much more normal book. It's also interesting comparing these two volumes, Volume 1 and Volume 13. Volume 13 is much bigger. So somebody made the decision at some point that the later volumes needed to be even bigger and wider. So, yeah, it's perfectly readable, but it does fit a little bit awkward in your lap. And this volume here, I hate to say this because it's a library book, but I don't think this was my fault, came apart while I was reading it. And you'll just have to trust me on this. I was not being rough with it at all. I was just picking it up and reading it, and it just broke off there. So hopefully the library can repair that. But yeah, the actual comics themselves. So this particular collection is a bit of a slog. I hate to say it, but this is not the best Dick Tracy. And if you've read the early Dick Tracy comics, you know exactly what I'm talking about. In fact, let's see. Yes, it's. Don't take my word for it. It says so right in the introduction to this volume. The strips reprinted in this book are not Chester Gould's finest work. He would have been the first to say so. But these early years nonetheless represent the most important work he ever did. So I guess the key part of that is, yeah, these are not his finest work. He was still finding himself as a storyteller and an artist. So, yeah. I read through this whole thing. Took me a long time to read through it. Normally you think comic books, you read through them quickly, but there is a lot of text in these comics. So it takes you a bit to work through these pages. And I don't know how long, I mean, I don't know. It took me about a week to read this whole thing. And I don't know what my hour count on it was, but it took me a while, and a lot of it was a little bit of a slog, kind of like, why am I reading this? This is boring. Maybe this wasn't the best idea to go through and read all the Dick Tracy comics systematically. Maybe I was better off just getting the celebrated cases. But then, after finishing that, I've been reading the subsequent volume from 1950 to 1951, and this is actually really good. Stories are much better paced. There's more suspense in it. The climaxes are good. The humor is good. I mean, this is quite readable. So I guess the takeaway here is that the early stories are not great, but at some point they get much better. So again, I've not finished this volume yet. I'm just a little bit ways into it. But the stories I have read from volume 13 are very readable. This one, though, is a little bit of a slog. It's also noticeable how much the artwork changes. And I don't know if that would be, you can see that on my camera here. So this is the artwork from 1931. I mean, it's good for what it is, isn't it? But it's a little bit boring, isn't it? But Chester Gould developed as an artist, so compare that with his artwork from 1951. I mean, it's hard to even believe it's the same guy, huh? So I guess, yeah, his style did definitely develop over time. So as you can see in these 1951s, it's a lot more pop art, a lot more cartoonish, and a lot more visual. The characters take up more of the frame. There's not quite as much text. It's not quite as dialogue heavy, and the dialogue is much bigger as opposed to these 1931s. Where, yeah, look at how small that dialogue is. And by the time we get to the Sunday pages in the back, some of this dialogue, I felt like I had to squint at a bit to make this out. Granted, I am middle-aged, so my eyesight is going now, but nonetheless. So, yeah, aside from the fact that these are very talky, and that the artwork is not as developed as it would be in later years, the story is meandering in these early issues. Now, I read back in 1990 when I had a few Dick Tracy books, and one of them, there was a quote from Chester Gould, or an interview with Chester Gould, the writer, where he says that he likes to think of Dick Tracy as one continuous detective story. And he doesn't like breaking it into sections like his fans do. So, you know, when you get the reprinted Dick Tracy, there's like Dick Tracy versus Flat Top, Dick Tracy versus the Brow, Dick Tracy versus the Mole. And each story is a distinct entity. But Chester Gould said, no, he likes to think of it as all one continuous story. So that quote stuck with me because I thought, I wonder if you were to read all the strips as they were originally published without any editor or anyone breaking them up, would it all read like one continuous story? Would each story flow seamlessly into the next? I think by the time we get to the 1950s, it is distinct storylines with distinct villains. But here in the 1931 to 1933 strips, you can see more of what he's going for one continuous story. So different antagonists come and go, but they quite often come back. Let me talk about what I mean a bit. So Dick Tracy starts off fighting Big Boy and his gang. And they go through several different episodes. So Big Boy stays as the antagonist for a long time. Tracy foils some of Big Boy's schemes, but never seems to lock up Big Boy himself, and it just drags on a bit. Then he finally does lock up Big Boy himself, and then Big Boy's in prison, and his crew try to get Big Boy out of prison, and that's a storyline for a while. Then various elements of Big Boy's gang, Tracy will try and... here's one of Big Boy in prison, and his minions are trying to break him out of prison, and Tracy keeps foiling their plots. Anyways, yeah, there are surviving members of Big Boy's gang that Tracy is tracking down, or they're trying to get their revenge on Tracy. And there are other con artists or criminals that float in and out of these pages. Tracy will lock horns with them for a while, then they'll escape, then they'll come back a month or two later to get up to some more antics. And it's interesting to a point, kind of seeing the way that there isn't in these early years a clear demarcation of different villains. There's just much more of a flowing story. That's the positive way to look at this. The negative way to look at this is that the stories do not have the proper climatic beats. They tend to just be an endless slog in which things happen, but the story doesn't really seem to go anywhere or build to anything. I mean, I don't know. Maybe that's me being a little harsh. There are some climaxes here in this story, but there are also sections where it feels like there are just things happening, but not very good storytelling. And again, I'm not done with this volume yet, but from the parts I've been reading, this 1950-1951 volume, this definitely seems much paced. These stories definitely do seem paced much better, with building up to climaxes and then resolutions. So, yeah, I'm finding the 1950 Dick Tracy to be much more readable than the 1931 Dick Tracy. In fact, I don't know if I'd recommend this unless you're a completist and you want to read the whole Dick Tracy saga from the first strip to the last strip. Then I guess you have to start here. But if you're not a completist, this isn't very compelling reading. Which is not to say there aren't little interesting things here and there. I mean, one interesting thing is these strips are almost 100 years old now. I mean, when I was first reading Dick Tracy strips in 1990, 1930 already seemed like it was very old. But time marches on, and now 1931 is, in a few short years, 1931 will be 100 years from now. And anytime you're reading something that old, you get a glimpse into a way of life or lifestyles that are pretty forgotten now. I mean, unless you're really old. Yeah, well, I mean, how old would you have to be to remember 1930? You'd have to be really old to remember those days. So there are just all sorts of little details. There's one reference here, to flagpole sitting, which was a fad in the 1920s. People would sit up on flagpoles as like a test of endurance, or you can look this up on Wikipedia, flagpole sitting. It was a thing at one point in time. So flagpole sitting is integrated into one of these strips. It's interesting also the use of their recording technology. For example, maybe this is just showing off my ignorance, but I didn't know you could make recordings of stuff in 1930s. I mean, I knew that records were around in the 1930s, but I thought records were something you bought from stores. I didn't know like the ordinary people could just record records. But apparently you can. At one point in here, I'm not sure if I'm going to be able to find it, but if I can't find it, just take my word for this. At one point, Dick Tracy takes a phonograph into the bushes to get the criminal's plan on recording. Let me see if I can find it here. And here we go. So This old-fashioned spring-operated dictaphone will be hid in the tree and will pick up their conversation. We'll see what this is all about. So, I guess they did have technology. The dictaphone would make grooves on the records. In another panel, they talk about the difference between the soft records that you can record on and the hard records that you buy from the store. So and I don't know how you would get the electricity for this thing out in the middle of the woods. This is before batteries, I believe. Although he does mention that it's spring operated. Maybe that's where the power comes from. So he records these criminals talking to each other, and then he plays it for one of the girls involved so that she knows what's going on. Sorry, I know that doesn't make any sense. You kind of have to read the whole story. But he records these criminals talking and then plays it back on the phonograph. Those kind of things are really interesting. The other thing which may be of note is that number of the staples of the Dick Tracy strip are set up here. So Dick Tracy getting engaged to Tess Trueheart, his one true love, and Dick Tracy finding Dick Tracy Jr. There's a picture of Dick Tracy Jr. Here it is. He rescues Dick Tracy Jr. from Steve the Tramp. Dick Tracy Jr. will go on to become a staple of this strip. His function in most of these storylines is to get captured, and then Dick Tracy has to go save him. And I think it's a little bit tiresome. It is, I regret to say, I think a function of his character which continues into the 1950s strips. We also get Dick Tracy's origin story here. Dick Tracy is just an ordinary guy until his girlfriend's father gets shot in front of him, and then he gets deputized by the chief of police. It's an origin which the comic strip itself seems to forget about, because within a few months we're treating Dick Tracy as if he's been a veteran of the police force for years. So I guess this origin gets retconned, or is this still canon, or I don't know. But the comic strip itself seems to forget about this origin. There are some interesting moments in here. But on the whole, I'm not sure I enjoyed reading it. And because I got this book on interlibrary loan, I guess maybe I underestimated the timing of how long it would take me to get these. I was intending for this one to come later, and then they both came all more or less at once. And, library books, they've got a due date on them. So I'm like, okay, I've got to read this one quickly so I can return it to the library so I can get started on this one. And that made it even more of a slog because, now it's like, okay, I've got a free hour tonight. I've got to get reading on this. And it's like, oh, this is so boring. But for better or for worse, I read through the whole thing. I don't know. I hate to complain too much about a comic book as being boring and difficult to get through because, there are people out there on BookTube who are reading big, hard, serious books that they're having trouble getting through. But as comics go, this is a little bit boring. But Dick Tracy does get better. So next, we're going to skip volumes 2 through 12. And I'm going to come back with volume 13, seeing Dick Tracy in the 1950s. Until then. Oh, and by all means, let me know in the comments what your experience of Dick Tracy is. Do you still read his comic strip in the paper? When did you first hear about him? Do you remember that movie from the 1990s, which was such a big deal for a couple months and then just totally disappeared into obscurity, etc.?